Hi everyone, thanks again so much for coming to my talk. I have to say it's quite fitting to be giving a decolonial talk on the topic of non-Indigenous depictions of indigeneity and of consumption a few days after Thanksgiving, and my Thanksgiving was actually last night, so the timing is not lost on me. Some brief additional housekeeping before we start. That's my Twitter handle @erudite on the slide there. If you have questions later on or want to start a larger conversation or something, feel free to follow me, DM me, whatever works. Second, I have two cats, Edith and Fern, who hopefully won't be super disruptive. However, they might start fighting from a lack of attention. So if you hear screaming and thumping from inside the flat, I swear it's my cats, which is a very Gothic thing to have to say. In fact, Fern is underfoot right now rolling a little ball around. So hopefully that won't be too disruptive for you. Finally, on a more serious note, although there are no pictures of gore in this presentation, there's a lot of talk about blood and viscera throughout, which will be pretty unavoidable. As we're talking about coloniality, there will also be some offensive racial language at times when talking about passages in the film and the novel that I'm covering. It's their words, of course, not mine, and it's nothing too awful, but it's just something to be aware of. Included in the texts are explicit mentions of sexual and domestic violence and some homophobia. There are also going to be pictures of bones in order to discuss methods of identifying cannibalism in the anthropological record, and there will be some light nudity in one picture. The pictures will have warnings before, and I'll let you know when they're gone afterwards, but the language won't. It's going to be pretty pervasive, so that's just, again, something to be aware of. So, this paper started out as a final exam for an anthropology class I took in grad school, and then was made into a paper I presented at the International Gothic Association conference in 2018. It's now evolved into part of my PhD thesis and my larger research interests. I found that it's really fruitful to combine anthropological studies on cannibalism with literary and film analyses of cannibalism. This is partly because of the similarities in how both topics talk about the discipline. Talk about the topic. I'm sorry, Fern has already thrown me off. Ugh. Okay, both anthropology and Gothic studies point to Enlightenment principles as a main reason behind the widespread Western connotation of cannibalism with barbarity. This is because during the Enlightenment, Europe began to see itself on an upward trajectory from barbarity to some ideal of progress and perfection. Included in this theory of modernity was the idea that some people, more specifically people who were not Western European, rich and white, were on a lower point in the imaginary line towards perfection. The qualities that Enlightenment thinkers, and more specifically Descartes, valued are qualities that are still privileged in the US and Europe today and have been used historically to justify colonization. Descartes' 1637 treatise, Discourse on the Method of Rightly Conducting the Reason and Seeking the Truth in the Sciences, is the work that most clearly establishes these Enlightenment/colonial values. Descartes draws a hard line between the value of the senses versus the value of the mind. The senses, Descartes argues, can deceive us. Therefore, our mind is the only true and objective thing with which to understand the world around us. Now, putting aside that this is tautological nonsense, Descartes' thesis that the senses lie and the mind is objective is important because of its popularity and its roots in colonial epistemology, colonial thinking. In order to be a modern or Cartesian subject, one must invest their identity in a colonial thought process that rejects anything connected to the body and privileges an Enlightenment idea of what is quote-unquote rational. You may also note from this slide that many of the things considered primitive are also associated with femininity, and many of the things considered modern are associated with masculinity. This is not a coincidence. To me, it's important to show that both anthropology and Gothic studies highlight the Enlightenment and the Cartesian subject as a major reason why cannibalism is still considered taboo. I think a lot of the time, humanities in general can get on a bit of a high horse in regard to being more, no pun intended, enlightened than scientific counterparts who are seen as less emotional and therefore more prone to being callous with their research. This clearly isn't the case, and to me is just another iteration of how deeply Cartesian thinking is embedded within the academic world. Furthermore, as anthropologist C. Richard King points out with this quote, cultural and media critiques of cannibalism are likely to reproduce colonial values regarding cannibalism, just in the reverse. In other words, the colonizers consuming the culture and resources of the colonized is put forward as a kind of cannibalism. However, this position still relies upon seeing cannibalism as a barbaric act. With King's observation in mind, I'll move on to the structure of the rest of the presentation, which is in two parts. First, we're going to look at a site in the American Southwest called 5M-TUMR 2346. This is a site that has been proven so far to be a site where pre-colonial survival cannibalism happened. I'm going to talk about the methods anthropologists use to prove cannibalism in archaeological contexts, as far as they can prove it. In the second part, I will be looking at depictions of indigenous cannibalism and indigenous spirituality connected with cannibalism in two recent works. S. Craig Zoller's 2015 horror comedy film, Bone Tomahawk, and Alma Katsu's 2018 horror romance novel, The Hunger. Throughout this analysis, I will demonstrate that colonial epistemology is alive and well through these works. Both Bone Tomahawk and The Hunger use a colonial frontier setting to attempt to draw attention to colonial issues. However, both sensationalize cannibalism rather than trying to understand or empathize with the reasons for cannibalism. In doing so, Zoller and Katsu both reinforce colonial epistemology and colonial values, despite apparent attempts at moving toward a more progressive understanding of the impact of colonization on indigenous peoples. Therefore, both are imperial texts. Furthermore, their critical success indicates the firm hold that colonial epistemology still holds over mainstream American media. But first, let's start with the anthropology. For anthropologists, trying to determine motive and/or function of an act of cannibalism is one of the most important steps. And because of the ambiguity that can arise here, as well as individual cultural values that anthropologists might have, there's just a proliferation of terms. This breakdown of terms is from Tim D. White's book, Prehistoric Cannibalism at Mancos 5M-TUMR 2346. This slide gives the term, the name of the anthropologist or anthropologists who came up with the term, and when they did so. You can see just by looking at the slide that the entire issue of cannibalism within the anthropological community is very muddy, as it should be. There are a lot of factors at work with this topic. But I want to draw your attention to the number of terms in the aggressive column, particularly those last 5. In the popular cultural imagination, when most people hear the word cannibalism, they think of consumption of human flesh that is regular and culturally encouraged, as White puts it, basically where human is the main source of nutrients for a group. This is what occurs in Bone Tomahawk and is what many anthropologists refer to as dietary, customary, gourmet, or gustatory cannibalism. Far more descriptive and accurate, I believe, is a term that also doesn't fall into the affectionate or aggressive categories like medicinal cannibalism. As White puts it, this is survival cannibalism. As White puts it, this covers cases in which actual or perceived starvation leads to consumption. So survival cannibalism is one term that everyone seems to understand the significance of and agree on how to use it. It's also significant because it's the kind of cannibalism that happened in the historical events in The Hunger, and it's the kind of cannibalism that likely happened at Mancos 5M-TUMR 2346. So let's get into specifics for the actual site. As I said, 5M-TUMR 2346 is in the American Southwest, particularly in the Four Corners region. The site is in Colorado on the Mancos River, very close to the New Mexico border. The people who lived at the site were ancestral Pueblo, and this site had two separate occupations. The first in 1100 CE, where likely 18 to 33 people lived there, and the second 50 years later, where the population was potentially cut in half. The other important thing to note is that the original archaeologists who excavated the site found 4 primary burials. These are burials that are exactly how you would expect an ancestral Pueblo burial to look in terms of body position, burial goods with the body, etc. In stark contrast to the primary burials are the several bone beds, as anthropologists term them, that were found on the site. 2,106 bone fragments were found in these beds, and after examining them, anthropologists believe they belong to at least 17 adults and 12 children. The significance of these different burials becomes really important because, as that first quote on the slide says, the representation of the human bony remains in an archaeological context helps determine how a group of people might have felt about each other. It's the representation, the burial style of the remains, in addition to the bones themselves, that allows anthropologists to interpret the site in a certain way. Besides representation, any evidence of processing on the remains is also important. If any animal, humans included, are butchered, there will be certain marks that human tools leave on the bones. These most often are cut marks, percussion damage, fracture, and burning. Now I'm going to show you some pictures from the site of the burials and of the bones themselves. Again, my intent in showing these pictures is not to sensationalize, but to give you a better idea of the reality of the data that the scientists deal with, so we can later contrast that with depictions that are in film and literature. So on the left, you can see one of the primary typical ancestral Puebloan burials from the site. That image contrasts very much with the image of the bone bed on the right. As you can see, it appears that no care has been given to these bones during burial. There are remains from multiple different people. You can see several jaw bones there, and the kinds of bones are scattered all over without order. You can also see that several of the long bones appear to be smashed, which is a part of processing we'll get to in a second. First, we're going to look at cut marks. On this slide, you can see what anthropologists mean by defleshing types of cut marks. You have on the right sawing on the bone right above the teeth on the maxilla, kind of like right there. And on another skull, you have the long cut coming up from the teeth on the maxilla as well. If you look at the picture on the right, this is percussion damage on a humerus. That's the big arm bone, and it's very hard to break. The smashed in bit right above the joint is the percussion damage. It's important to note that long bones, like the humerus, also have spongy bone in them, which is rich in nutrients. On the picture on the left, the percussion marks are the little notches in the length of bone towards the bottom. And if you see that dark spot near the top, that is burning damage. Okay, so we're done with the pictures of bones. So processing marks of cut marks, burning, and percussion damage are all present on many bones in the 5M2MR 2346 collection. Those are also the kinds of processing marks on typical ancestral Pueblo butchered food. The processing tool marks on these bones means the modification of them is mostly, if not all, from humans. But as White notes, when examining the teeth, the population at 5M2MR 2346 were under nutritional stress. The time periods of occupation, 1100 CE and 1150 CE, coincide with a period of known social and climatic stress in the region. Therefore, the cannibalism that likely happened at 5M2MR 2346 is probably survival cannibalism. We've just seen how anthropologists investigate cannibalism in the archaeological record and a specific case study that has withstood the test of time thus far. Cannibalism in reality is complicated, and it could be that in the future, White's thesis of survival cannibalism is disproven. Now let's look at something utterly uncomplicated: sensational gustatory cannibalism in Bone Tomahawk and the Hunger. I'm going to start with a summary of both texts. Then we'll look at how both fall into the categories of Romantic and Imperial Gothic. With this framework in mind, I'll then take a focused look at how both texts construct a romantic ideal of the West and of the male settler colonist. I will then show how each text uses cannibalism as a way to further divide good colonial subjects from indigenous others, therefore relying on colonial epistemology and stereotypes to create a romantic vision of Western expansion, one in which the monstrous other is conquered by the heroic colonizer. Written and directed by S. Craig Zahler, Bone Tomahawk bills itself as horror, comedy, and Western in equal parts. Zahler's story follows protagonists Sheriff Franklin Hunt and cattle drover manager Arthur O'Dwyer from the fictional town of Bright Hope in the American Southwest region. Arthur has recently broken his leg and therefore been forced to stay home during the latest cattle drive. With him is his wife Samantha, the town doctor. One evening, a suspicious character shows up at the town saloon and is shot in the leg by Hunt. Arthur's wife Samantha is called away to remove the bullet. During the night, while most people are asleep, a group of faceless savages invades the town, kidnapping Samantha, the injured man, and the town's deputy, Nick. Hunt, Arthur, the town's dandy-turned-Indian killer Bruder, and the deputy Chicory then set out on a 3-day ride to save the captives from the murderous group of troglodytes. And if you're unaware, troglodyte is a pejorative term for a cave dweller, and although it's pretty problematic, it will be the primary way I refer to this fictional cannibal group because it's the primary way they're referenced in the film. That's just what we have to work with. Alma Katsu's novel, The Hunger, is a romance horror retelling of the real, ill-fated history of the Donner Party. The Donner Party was a group of 87 settlers who traveled west on the Oregon-California Trail in 1846. They took what was supposed to be a shortcut on the advice of a guidebook written by a man who had never actually gone on the trail. In doing so, they added 2 months to their journey through uncleared forests and across a salt desert that decimated their livestock and the last of their supplies. The party was stranded just short of California in the Sierra Nevada mountains as winter descended. After the hardships they faced on the trail and with almost no supplies left, the Donner Party members were forced to resort to cannibalism while they waited for spring or for rescue, whichever came first. Only 48 out of 87 party members survived. Pictured here are the actual men that Katsu marks as her main heroes and her villain. All the way on the left is Charles Stanton. In real life, he helped the party many times, and in Katsu's retelling, this is amplified, as he is one of the only party members with a conscience that repeatedly tries to help other people. Katsu also takes liberties with Stanton's appearance, making him significantly taller and more dashing than he was in real life. Sorry, Charles. In the middle picture is James Reed, a wealthy leader of the wagon party who made everyone press on through the fake shortcut, even when it was clear that doing so was intensely stupid. Reed also killed a teamster, John Snyder, on the trail for tangling their wagons together. In Katsu's novel, he is a downtrodden, closeted gay man whose good sense stands in opposition to the rest of the party and who kills Snyder, with whom he is having an affair, in self-defense. The novel ends with a scene of absolution for Reed. Finally, the man with the striking eyes is Louis Keseberg, a poor German immigrant who in real life was not a great person. He was known to beat his wife and was directly responsible for several deaths on the trail because of neglect, although the same could be said for Reed. He was also the last person to be rescued from the mountain camp and was vocal about having eaten human flesh. In Katsu's portrayal, Keseberg is the carrier of a genetic, blood-borne disease that spreads insidiously through the wagon party, making them more prone to violence and more prone to accepting cannibalism in the mountains. He is also a child molester and an unapologetic racist. Though James Reed and Charles Stanton both participated in Indian wars in real life and in the text, it is Keseberg's anti-Indigenous racism that is highlighted far more frequently. I also feel that I should add, apart from the very questionable liberties I would say that Katsu takes, this is overall just a terribly written novel. It constantly contradicts itself, the prose is purple, and any comments it consciously makes about society are painfully commonplace and obviously pro-colonial, despite attempts at appearing woke. Bone Tomahawk at least has the courtesy to be entertaining and well filmed, technically. One of the major similarities between the texts that I want to emphasize here is the way that they both bring sexual desire to the forefront of the conflict. This is often heterosexual desire, but not always, as is the case with James Reed's internalized homophobia. But in both Bone Tomahawk and The Hunger, the heterosexual family is an institution that is directly challenged by the indigenous and cannibal antagonists, and therefore must be protected by the colonizer protagonists. In fact, in The Hunger, there are 6 different main narrators. 5 of these narrators have a romantic conflict throughout the novel. 4 of these narrators lose their perspectives when their romantic interest is lost, despite the fact that the party is still trapped in the mountains, which you would think is a more pressing issue than who's going to get married, but apparently not. In Bone Tomahawk, the entire plot centers around Arthur's attempts to rescue his wife Samantha from her troglodyte kidnappers. Both texts end with the victorious, if bittersweet, re-establishment of a middle to upper class settler colonial family unit. Bone Tomahawk with Samantha's rescue, and The Hunger with Reed's reunion with his wife and children, which comes with a deeper commitment to his role as a father and, in an underhanded kind of way, giving up being gay. The triumph of the settler family, then, is inextricable in both texts from the triumph of the male settler over an indigenous and or otherwise underprivileged cannibal monster. This demonstrates how the Romantic and Imperial Gothic modes work together to reinforce colonial paradigms and values through the monstrous figure of the cannibal. It is possible to begin to question the justness of coloniality in these texts, but in the end, a colonial order must be reestablished and the Gothic monstrous other defeated. The vision of the West and Western expansion that both texts create, then, is one that places the focus not on the horrors of colonization, but on the experiences of white settlers. This is an ultimately romantic depiction of colonization, one that maintains commitments to the colonial paradigm, even as both texts make cursory attempts at acknowledging that colonization is bad. All the male protagonists in Bone Tomahawk are representations of civilization and masculinity fighting against barbarism. But perhaps the worst offender is the character Bruder, played by Matthew Fox. When Bruder volunteers to join the hunt for the cannibals, he states, "I've killed more Indians than everyone here put together. It isn't a boast, but a fact." Though Bruder claims not to be bragging, the statement is obviously heavy with colonial history. Bruder's storyline exemplifies one of the main uses of Native Americans in American Gothic works. Renee Berglund explains that, in the American imagination, Native American ghosts function both as representations of national guilt and as triumphant agents of Americanization. In the case of Bruder, the Native ghosts are metaphorical, always alluded to but never seen. However, their purpose within the narrative is just as Berglund states. They allow for Bruder to be seen both as dangerous and guilty, but also as a quintessentially American man who has triumphed over the other. Only one character, the dopey but well-meaning Deputy Chicory, repeatedly voices distaste for Bruder's racism. When Bruder kills two Mexican travelers who come upon their camp one night, Chicory states, "Mr. Bruder just educated two Mexicans on the meaning of manifest destiny." Additionally, when another group of Mexicans attempt to steal Bruder's horse, Bruder claims, "Saucy'd never allow some, insert slur here, on her back," to which Chicory replies, "You train her in bigotry?" Yet the narrative ultimately does not reward Chicory's protests against racism. Quite to the contrary, it supports Bruder. Bruder kills the first group of Mexican travelers because he believes they are scouts for a raiding party. It turns out that he was correct, as the protagonists are later followed and the dead men's compatriots steal their horses. When the Mexican raiders are unable to steal Saucy, they mortally wound her, and Bruder is forced to put her out of her misery in a tearful scene that humanizes him through his love for his horse. In the end, Bruder is given a redemption arc. He confesses a troubled past in which his family was killed by Native Americans when he was just 10 years old, thus explaining and partially justifying his own murder of 116 Native Americans, women and children included. In the final act, Bruder dies heroically and mortally wounded, drawing the troglodytes away from Hunt and Chicory. Despite his violence, Bruder is depicted as a complex and ultimately good man, which reinforces the white colonizing Cartesian male as good as well. In The Hunger, Romanticism is established through drawing contrasts between socioeconomic classes. While the upper and middle class men, such as Reed and Stanton, are seen as just and fair, the underprivileged, specifically Keseberg and Snyder, are not just barbaric and irrational. They frequently undermine the authorities of the Wagon Party leaders with snide comments and outright objections to some of their leaders' decisions. Significantly, this is seen not just as subordination by all the prospective narrators, who, it should be noted, are all upper or middle class. Keseberg and Snyder's questioning of party leadership sets a dangerous precedent that makes it easier for others in the party to undermine their authority. This destabilization of established colonial hierarchies forms a large part of the horror and tension throughout the novel. It is also, as you can see from the second quote about Reed being attracted to Snyder, connected to a sort of perverted animalistic sexuality that Reed must and does eschew by the end of the novel. Class is also central to understanding that third quote, which is from narration by Tamsin Donner. This quote, apart from being horrible prose, speaks to the deep socioeconomic divide that the narrators create between themselves and the poorer party members. Keseberg and Snyder have already infected the other underprivileged settlers with prejudice against Stanton, as you can see from the first quote on the slide. Tamsin's assessment of Stanton's character, therefore, is reliant upon the unreliability of the rest of the party. The value system of the prospective characters in The Hunger is then reliant upon seeing those of lower socioeconomic classes than them, not just as less than, but as a dangerous horde that must be defeated. In a book full of romantic plot lines, the protective and romantic natures of the quote-unquote good male settlers, most notably Stanton, provide another mechanism for establishing difference between good and bad models of settler colonialism. Before they get trapped in the mountains and the mysterious hunger truly begins to set in, Stanton considers leaving the party in order to search for Bryant, who he believes is lost in the wilderness. Ultimately, however, his romantic attraction to Mary and his masculine sensibilities lead him to determine that he must stay to protect the party as a whole. Stanton, therefore, represents pure and good romance. Stanton embraces his role as protector of innocence. Notably, the only people Stanton deems in need of protection are the women and children of the party. Almost all the women are reduced to their physical delicacy, Mary's inability to fight off an attacker, the fine line of Tamsin's mouth, and the pale, delicate hands of Doris Wolfinger. The exception to this is Peggy Breen, but Peggy Breen is also the only happily married member of Stanton's mental list that also has many children. Therefore, her loud teasing denotes her not as a potential romantic conquest or damsel, but an archetypal mother figure whose potential proclivity to be overbearing is still well-meaning. Stanton thus sees himself as fulfilling the archetypal father role of protector and benevolent overseer. The individual personalities of all the people in his mental list are not as important to Stanton as what they represent. A flock of helpless sheep who need someone to safely and justly guard and guide them. In stark contrast to Stanton's dashing romantic settler attitude, Keseberg's villainy is extended to a sexual threat he poses to the party. Once the party is stranded in the mountains, Keseberg begins to sexually assault the younger girls in the party. Because Keseberg is also the carrier of the blood-borne disease that drives the infected to cannibalism and rage, his sexuality also instills a threat of miscegenation. This provides yet more evidence to the privileged narrators that poor whites like Keseberg must be expunged from society for the safety of socioeconomically privileged groups. Keseberg and those like him are a threat to the romantic ideals of manifest destiny, which the dashing Stanton and the dashing Bruder both uphold. So just a brief warning now, we're going to get into some more slides you might find worrisome as we move to discussing depictions of indigeneity in the texts. Again, there's no gore, but this first one does have nudity, and the one afterwards has a guy chewing on a leg, so the next two slides you might want to walk away from. But you've been warned. Here we go. Incriminating in terms of colonial ideology and racial otherness is, of course, Zoller's depiction of the troglodytes themselves, and especially their gustatory cannibalism. In the most gruesome scene of the film, a group of troglodytes scalps Deputy Nick and bisects him down the spine while he is alive and conscious in order to eat him. Hunt, Chicory, and Samantha watch as Nick is butchered, and Hunt promises his dying deputy all these savages are going to be massacred. From a decolonial perspective, Hunt's language posits that the only response to witnessing acts of cannibalism is equally violent revenge. However, the scene could also be viewed from an anthropological perspective. By comparing what we know about cannibalism from 5M TUMR 2346 to the depiction of cannibalism in Bone Tomahawk, it becomes clear that the cannibalism in the latter is purposefully sensational and therefore, I would argue, purposefully inflammatory. Remember, archaeologists determine cannibalism partly from marks of processing on the bones. So let's examine processing of the bones in Bone Tomahawk. In the film, Deputy Nick is bisected with an instrument that appears to be made out of a jawbone similar to that of a horse, although it's difficult to tell exactly what kind of bone it is. The bisection with this tool is almost surgically smooth without interruption, even though it is straight down the spine, which would be impossible. In fact, after a few swings of the bone instrument, which only hit Nick in the tailbone, the two troglodytes holding Nick's feet simply pull, and the whole spine separates down to the midsection, even though the bone instrument hasn't touched that part of the spinal column at all. It's almost like he's a perforated notebook page that just perfectly splits. So this act of bisection is simply there for gross out value and to dehumanize the people, the troglodytes, doing it. After the bisection scene, the only other act of cannibalism audiences see is this, a troglodyte chewing on a calf muscle. The foot is attached to the leg and the flesh is uncooked. There is no sign of percussion damage to get at the nutrient-rich spongy bone in the tibia. The lack of burning, defleshing, and the lack of percussion damage separate the troglodytes in Bone Tomahawk from the archaeological record at 5M TUMR 2346. However, this image also reinforces colonial imagery of an indigenous group. Through this image, we see that the troglodytes do not butcher the meat to completion or cook the meat, which in turn doesn't allow them to depersonalize the meat, which means the meat still looks human, which means the troglodytes enjoy eating humans, which means, according to that imaginary line of modernity, that the troglodytes are subhuman. Their lack of humanity justifies the protagonists in viewing the troglodytes as animals, butchering them just as they butchered Nick. Yet the violence the white protagonists inflict is seen as justice. In this way, Bone Tomahawk only reinforces the same absolute binaries between civilized white humans and barbaric indigenous peoples, the same binaries that colonial epistemology is rooted in. Of course, it is clear that Zoller never intended for Bone Tomahawk to mimic real-life cannibalism. Indeed, Bone Tomahawk is supposed to be over the top and ridiculous. The scene of the troglodyte casually gnawing on a leg with foot attached is supposed to be a sight of comedy. In my opinion, this intention only serves to further illuminate the underlying colonial worldview of the film. If Zoller's intent was to not recreate colonial ideology, as Chicory's dialogue appears to be doing, he could have portrayed cannibalism as the complex and sometimes necessary act it is. Fictional indigenous cannibals never needed to enter the picture at all. Instead, Bone Tomahawk is proof that colonial values are still being produced and being presented as harmless entertainment. Bone Tomahawk and The Hunger both mythologize cannibalism, drawing on tropes rooted in colonial stereotypes. Mythologizing cannibalism allows for these images of an indigenous other to be popularized and perpetuated even into today. This is again why I think it's important to contrast media portrayals of cannibals with the archaeological record. The former is a lazy recreation of colonial values and images, while the latter more often provides a nuanced understanding of an act that is common across all cultures. In The Hunger, the fictitious indigenous group is called the Anawai, which is a completely made-up word as far as I've been able to tell. And the Anawai are curiously aligned with cannibalistic whites, led by Keseberg. The Anawai treat the white cannibals as gods that require sacrifice. This results in Katsu linking diseased white abhumans with indigenous cosmology, further othering both groups. Furthermore, despite the Anawai predating colonialism, they are completely reliant on white cannibals for their spiritual rituals. In the novel, the doctor/scientist William Bryant leaves the wagon party early on to look for different indigenous groups in the wilderness. Bryant learns of the cosmology of the fictional Anawai from a group of Washoe who vehemently deny any association between themselves and the abject Anawai. Bryant's insight into the Anawai comes completely secondhand. This group, like the group of cannibals in Bone Tomahawk, are never allowed a voice. Rather, they are scrutinized by Bryant through secondhand accounts from other indigenous groups. Tellingly, Stanton also comes to the same conclusions as Bryant, even though he has no contact with any indigenous groups throughout the novel. Both Bryant and Stanton conclude that the white cannibal is an iteration of the Anawai's equivalent of a demon, the Nait. Because the Anawai themselves do not have a voice in the text, and because both men's conclusions reinforce each other, the reader is expected to agree with Bryant and Stanton's conclusion. In effect, the poor white cannibals are seen as monstrous, and the Anawai are seen as too stupid and superstitious to understand that cannibalism is a disease, rather than a godlike power. Both men surmise that the Anawai worship the white cannibals because they have no other explanation. As Stanton states, they truly had no other context for why the diseased whites would be committing cannibalism. For Bryant, the Anawai's sacrifices demonstrate that the presence of white cannibals amplified some of their ancient belief systems. The worldview of the heroes Stanton and Bryant, then, is exactly like the colonial Enlightenment values of modernity. The Anawai are objects of study lower on the scale of progress than Stanton and Bryant, who are more progressed and therefore an authority, even upon cultures they've never spoken to or interacted with directly. The Anawai's monstrosity still remains a site of horror, however, despite its supposed white origin. The image of the child the Anawai sacrificed to the cannibals in this first quote is especially horrific when contrasted with Stanton's attitude toward the children. Stanton is willing to risk his own life to save the children he doesn't even know the names of. The Anawai, on the other hand, actively kidnap and brutalize these same faceless children. Additionally, according to Bryant, the Nait is a demon figure in the Anawai mythology. The willingness of the Anawai to leave sacrifices for a demon, then, further marks them out as dangerous and othered. Even if there is a quote-unquote logical explanation for cannibals in the text, which is that they are actually just victims of a disease, the Anawai remain illogical, bound to a worldview that leaves their society stunted and influenced easily by white colonizers. But the second quote on this slide is especially interesting to me because it describes burials not of the Anawai, but of the Washoe or Paiute. The description of the bodies is horrific. The bodies are desecrated corpses with the flesh cooked and charred. Of course, these words also conjure images of cannibalism since cooking is a form of processing. What this passage demonstrates is that all indigenous people, fictional or based in reality, voiceless or not, are othered by the hunger. They're all in some way abhorrent. Either their burial practices are not burial practices at all, but sacrifices, like the Anawai kidnapping, or they cook and char their loved ones, like the Washoe or Paiute burial. Katsu's depiction of indigenous people is therefore not progressive at all. The Anawai may not be cannibals themselves, but they have no qualms about feeding the cannibals through equally horrific means. However, these depictions of fictional indigenous people do not seem to bother critics. Both The Hunger and Bone Tomahawk are well received critically, and I'd like to close the presentation with an argument as to why this matters. When narratives like Bone Tomahawk and The Hunger go unchallenged for their portrayals of indigenous people and their romanticism of Western expansion, the paradigm of colonialism goes unchallenged. It is not just that these critics don't pick up on the reinforcement of colonial values in Bone Tomahawk and The Hunger. It is that they enjoy the coloniality. They find the privileging of white settler stories over indigenous stories to be not only entertaining, but even artful. So I'd like to leave you with this quote from Sheree Deckard and Stephen Shapir's collection, World Literature, Neoliberalism, and the Culture of Discontent. The critics who I quoted on the previous slide fall into this latter category that Deckard and Shapiro identify as those for whom world literature is more purely a matter of formalist analysis, humanist appreciation or taste or datafied analysis, and whose criticism presents no threat to neoliberal consensus as such. I contend that analysis of colonial literature and film in particular is a space that is possibly most obviously fruitful for anti-establishment, anti-neoliberal, and anti-colonial work to be done. It must be done when we look at works like Bone Tomahawk and The Hunger. When Euro-Americans see depictions of indigenous cannibalism and indigenous cosmology reduced to a voiceless boogeyman, it should be seen as a cheap scare, a dated colonial paradigm, and evidence of a flawed epistemology. The only way to begin to understand America's horrific past as horrific is to stop portraying it as romantic. Western expansion wasn't romantic then, and it isn't romantic now. The disaster that is colonialism can never be fixed. The harm can never be undone. But certainly, the least we can do as a culture is to stop uplifting white settler colonists as heroes and making the colonized into stereotypes and monsters. Thank you. I'll stop sharing.